Hey everyone, and welcome to another tutorial on painting Sigvald the Magnificent. And this is probably the most magnificent part because in this one we're going to go over the gold, which I guess is the main part really. I think the hardest part will depend on each person. Like I said to you in the first tutorial, I found the hair the most irritating. But to you guys, I'm guessing that it's probably going to be the non-metallic. I'd be interested in knowing which you found the hardest after painting it, or just what you think's the hardest going into it. But yeah, hopefully I can help you with some of those things in this tutorial. We're going to go over the steps for Sigvald, but first I want to go over some theory or just some kind of tips that I think will help you with your NMM in general. Some things or some little tricks that will help you when painting any non-metallic for any miniature, and also telling you why I did certain things, like why I chose the colours I did and why I place things in certain ways. And I hope that's the most useful thing for you in this tutorial. So the paints I used are fairly standard for me when it comes to painting gold. Citadel Rhinox Hide for the dark shadows, English uniform, Japanese uniform, pastel yellow or ice yellow, some ivory and some Mournfang brown. I normally riff off of these colours and it does vary when I do other models, but these colours are kind of my go-tos and I know they work, and when I was painting this I needed something I knew would work. You probably know that when we're painting gold we're using browns, we're using ochres, we're using yellows. But I think the important thing is to understand about the saturation. So it's how bright is that yellow in your gold. And that's really going to dictate the look of it. I like a nice antique gold, so I actually try and make it reasonably desaturated. And we have a strong yellow in there with Japanese uniform. And how much of this Japanese uniform we use kind of dictates how saturated it will be in the end. So I'm going to mix the colours on the palette and explain to you why I use these colours in certain amounts. I'm never precise with my mixes, so I can't give you, and I don't like to give you, precise ratios such as 1 to 2. I think you need to learn to mix on the palette and understand why you add more or less of a colour in, learning to control the saturation, the values, the tone. So I use English uniform with a little bit of Japanese uniform mixed in. And this is what I meant by the amount of Japanese you add kind of dictates the saturation. English uniform on its own isn't quite yellow enough, but personally for my eyes, pure Japanese makes gold look maybe a little yellow. And then we use colours like ice yellow or ivory to obviously add brightness, increase the value. But the whole time we're trying to balance the saturation and the tone of this gold. And actually the tones that I create on my gold is something I'm quite proud of, like, you know, being able to make that antique look, which is what I wanted. And you can see I just make mixes by adding in more ice yellow. And actually the brighter ones are pretty desaturated. They look quite boring on the palette, but I know that they'll create a nice non-metallic metal in the end. If we take some Japanese uniform and add ice yellow directly to it, you can see by comparison it's much brighter. It's still not a really bright color, obviously, because Japanese isn't a really bright yellow, but by comparison to the mixes I've made, you can see it is more saturated. And you actually need to adjust this to your taste. So I'm telling you that I desaturated because I like the look of it, but if you like it bright, then you should maybe use some brighter colours. Later we'll talk about counter reflections or secondary reflections, and a great tip I have for that is to have a different tone for these counter reflections. So you can see I use a little Mournfang brown added to English uniform to make it slightly more orange, altering the tone, and then we can add ice yellow to that if we need to create some highlights, and just add some more Mournfang brown if it gets too light, and English uniform and any Japanese to balance it. You just need to make a nice colour that's a variation of your main colour. I would love to make some fancy graphics where I explain to you what I want to say, but I'm not quite there yet. So what I'm going to do is paint on some pieces of paper. One of the most important things when painting non-metallic metal, and a lot of stuff actually, just generally painting with a style where you paint the volumes of the figure, is that each tone shouldn't be represented in an equal amount. And here what I'm doing is taking the tones we made from the palette and I'm painting them in a perfectly even amount. So this is something that people often do when layering and blending, is they go smaller each time with each tone, but it ends up being too even. And that even kind of transition doesn't create the non-metallic effect, or it doesn't look as good as we move through the colours fast. So what I'm going to do underneath is just to create a visual representation of what I'm talking about. So here I'm going to do a large amount of shadow, which will be Rhinox hide in this case. And I try taking a little bit of the colour there, but it doesn't quite work out for me as there's not enough paint there. But all these colours in the middle, which are kind of the mixes of English uniform, Japanese uniform, all that stuff, those are the midtones. And the key, I think, to make a shiny looking non-metallic metal is to move through the midtones fast. We need them to be there to create the transition, and we need the tones to make it look gold, but we need to go through them quick. And then we need large areas of light that best represent the shape that we're painting. So here I do that massive section of ice yellow, and you can see just by looking at the top and bottom what I mean, that each tone isn't represented in an equal amount. And those midtones are all there. There might be a lot of tones that we move through really fast. And later when we look at the model I've painted, hopefully this explanation and fantastic demonstration helps illustrate that. So here with another fantastic illustration, I'm going to kind of show how that can translate to us on the model. So I have a sphere here. Obviously it's a circle on paper, but this is how we would go and paint a sphere. Just like the mirror we did on the shield, we talked about that being a sphere and how that works. And it's going to be the same on some of the areas of Sigvald, like the pecs, that they're almost sphere shaped. You can see I've painted a large area of shadow with Rhinox hide here, and I've painted that counter reflection, that crescent moon on the bottom, and that's the slightly more orange Mournfang brown. And then I've done a big highlight with ice yellow, and I'm just trying to fill in those midtones with the other tones we created, but using a very small amount, so we're just ramping through quickly. The last little bit of on-paper demonstration, don't worry, you don't have to sit through too many of these, is what is the brush stroke we can do. So on this first one you can see I'm moving the brush towards the highlight, and I just did that little dot at the start to show you what we're aiming for. And this is how you can move the brush stroke to create smooth highlights, putting the most pigment in where we want it to be the brightest area. The other thing we could do is actually stipple the area on, or the highlight. The main highlight in the middle, you don't need to stipple, you can just draw that on. But then the outside, you can transition to the other colours by doing stippling. And this can give a beaten metal kind of look as well. And it's actually easier to blend in this way. I would try out both ways to see the advantages, the disadvantages, and which you prefer the look of. I used both during my painting of Sigvald. The other main technique we'll use will be glazing, and it's really interesting how glazing works well on either of these types of brushstroke that you use. If you aren't sure on glazing, then we did a fantastic video on painting a power sword, and this is basically the technique we use, highlighting and glazing. But here you can just see when we're trying to blend, what we'll do is move over the line and push the brush stroke outwards. And that's going to be the same if we do stippling or the regular layering technique. But what's interesting about the stippling is you can actually blend pretty well with stippling alone, but using glazes too works really well to just slightly soften those little dots, blend it even more, and for some reason it just works really well over stippling. It seems to adhere to the slightly rougher surface or something like that. So yeah, different types of brush stroke can be used to create the highlights, but glazing away from the light is generally what I'll do to blend these colours together. I hope those things make sense, and maybe when we go into the actual painting and I relate them to the painting of Sigvald, they make more sense. But these are some of my key tips for painting non-metallic metal, so it was really important that we talked about them. So in this first shot, I've just painted it Rhinox hide, maybe a little bit of black in there to get it really dark. That's because I pre-highlighted it and I didn't really want a pre-highlight. So if I was starting again and it was plain black, then I would probably just base coat the whole thing with some diluted Rhinox hide. You don't want the Rhinox hide to be too thick because it will be too reddish and too brown basically. But if it's diluted, it's slightly translucent and we just get a nice dark base tone. But don't be too fussy about that. I've put this next shot in because this is what I do when painting most projects. I just tested the recipe out on a part that's maybe not so important. Actually, this part's quite important because it was at the very front on the leg, but it's not like it was the chest or something like that. So maybe if you want to test out on another model or the back of the model or something like that. I always do this thing where I paint the most important part of the model because it's the bit I'm excited about. So say I paint on Sigvald the chest first because I think it's the cool area, and then I actually get better at painting whatever it is. Like I get better at using the colors I've chosen, or I get used to the method, and then some of the unimportant bits that I paint at the end are better. So typically I might paint the front first and the back's painted way nicer because I just practiced on the front. So I'm trying to do it the other way round, or even do a little test run before I go in. So in this shot I experimented with painting a kind of undertone of a more reddish brown, and it wasn't necessary. You'll see in the next photo I cover everything up on the main highlight, but I do use it for the secondary light or the counter reflection, and this is a kind of mix of Rhinox hide and Mournfang brown, so it's a lot redder than the rest of the colours we're going to use, which I like for, like I said, the counter reflections, but for the main light it's not necessary. In the next step is actually what I would do first of all over the Rhinox hide typically. So this is the first proper step, I guess, where we do some real painting and some layering, and this is English uniform with just a little bit of Rhinox hide, and the little bit of Rhinox hide in just makes it a touch darker, obviously desaturates it a little bit, and we want to paint really large highlights with this. You can see how much I'm covering with the chest, and this goes back what I talked about when I did my silly doodles on the paper, and talking about, each tone isn't represented in an even amount and ramping through to the colours quick. All those kind of tips. We need to paint a big highlight to give us lots of room to fit in the next highlights, but also leave the right amount of shadow. It's really easy to put more shadow back in because we'll just glaze Rhinox hide, and I had to do that a lot, especially on the shoulder pad. So definitely paint it too large rather than too small because we have quite a few layers to fit in. The advantage is you can see all my steps separately, and you can kind of look at how big my highlights begin and then how small I end up. And it's a mistake I always made with highlighting anything, is always beginning this kind of first mid-tony, sketchy light, just ending up too small. On this first highlight, really pay attention to the shapes of your highlight, because this is probably going to dictate your volume interpretation. What I mean by volume interpretation is the shape of the highlights you put on to the different shapes of the armor panels. And they can be done in different ways. It doesn't have to be a certain way, but there's normally typical highlight shapes that obviously fit more naturally with what we're trying to do. So if you look at the pec, I think that highlight's probably the most natural, that kind of roundish shape, and I think it drops off just at the right point where the angle changes into a shadow. And you can see here where the Mournfang brown sort of counter reflection is left, but I did end up covering that reddish undercolor I painted on before, so it was a bit of a waste of time. I would just paint on the counter reflection, and you could do that after this step actually rather than first. The best spots for this are on the arm. You can see there's an orange band on the underside of the arm, the pec on the left, and obviously all 6 of the abdominal plates. So this next step has just a little bit of Japanese uniform in it, so it's a yellowish tone, and this is what I talked about when we said that it has to ramp quickly through the covers, because you can see I've actually covered up most of the previous step, leaving just a thinnish band, but that tone is still there, and it will be important later to have all these tones just to make the transition look right and make it feel gold. You can also see I start to work on a smaller area, so I'm actually working on the main light on his left hand side, which is probably the most important part, the most focal, and it's what I wanted to be the brightest, because looking at the light hitting the shield, the light source is hitting those areas the most. So at the beginning I sort of do those early stages all together, but then when I start to be more detailed I like to paint maybe a section-ish at the time, and you can do this any way that fits your style. You might prefer to be more efficient and paint every step on every area. It all depends on how you want to work. And this is why I wanted to do that little bit of theory at the start, because as you can see the steps are quite simple. There's not that much for me to explain, because here we've added in some pastel yellow to the mix of Japanese and English uniform, and again I've just painted the same highlight shape, but it covers less space, and I'm leaving only a very thin band of the previous tone. But already we're starting to get a feel of what it looks like. I really like it at this step actually, especially on the chest. I really like how I rendered the chest. I didn't like how I painted the shoulder pad, and you'll see later I change it quite a lot by the end. But yeah, I definitely like how the pec's working, and you can see the importance of how big that first highlight is, because now, by comparison to the highlight, it seems quite dark. And like I was saying earlier, the steps are quite simple because you mix up the colours and you just go from dark to light, occupying a smaller space each time. But the real question is, how much of each tone is represented, what's the shape of that highlight, what's the contrast, how saturated are the tones. So it's actually all those kind of theory things that are important to making non-metallic metal work. And I think it's still difficult to paint it smooth and get it clean and the right shapes, but at least the actual process isn't, using crazy wet blending and different methods like that. You can just build up the layers. But getting those colours right, shapes right, is tricky in itself. So it's nice that there's some simple sides to it, I think. At this point, you can see I've pushed the highlight on the pec to pure pastel yellow. And again, it covers a massive area. It's not like a small dot. It's a huge highlight. But all those tones I painted before were worth it because it transitions nicely. And we haven't done any glazes yet, which can add more tone and blend it perfectly. And it already looks good, I think. And at this point, I was like, yeah, this is cool. This is going to be a great miniature. So it's nice to paint one area like that really well, because you know that the end result's going to be worth it. I knew the pec was going to be the brightest point, as well as the shoulder, in fact, which is why I kind of did it first. So I kind of pushed that contrast to the top as much as I could, and then there's going to be other areas where I don't go that bright. So it's nice to find a spot where you push it to the brightest, and then when you paint the other areas, you can make your comparisons and make sure they work with that strongest area of contrast. later I also added some small ivory spots to the upper abdominal armor and the pec itself, but it's not much brighter than ice yellow. The value is only a tiny bit lighter and it's just closer to white, but it was worth doing in those areas for sure. Just a subtle little bit more contrast. Moving on, basically repeating myself. We're just going to layer with the same colors. We mix up all the tones on the palette, and hopefully we mix up enough of each tone that we can, carry on painting the rest of the model. But it doesn't matter too much. You don't have to have the tones matching. The good thing about painting in this way is, you can have a recipe in a certain area, and that's a certain brightness, and it can actually be different on another side, like a shadow side, and that's actually kind of better than having it all the same and even throughout. It doesn't have to be perfect. So on his right hand side of the torso, our left here, you can see what I've started to do is highlight the abs as well and the chest, but they're a tiny bit darker because there's a split down the center of the torso and it's slightly shadowed from the main light. So the volumes are different. The pec on his right has a slightly smaller highlight and it's not quite as dark. So I go through exactly the same colors, but I stop before I get to pure pastel yellow. So I save that pure pastel yellow for the really bright areas. I used it on the thigh and the legs, but they're kind of out in the light because he's lifting his right leg up, and that will catch some light. But the torso is a different angle, so it's slightly covered. You can paint that main area of light, like I said, and then just work around the model and try and be logical and sort of work out by comparison how dark or light something's going to be. So you know that the other side of the torso is going to be slightly darker, but it's going to be lighter than parts like the leg, which face downwards. So you just have to kind of go through, use a bit of logic, and you highlight it up all the same, but you'll stop when you think, okay, this is light enough for where it is on the model. And then you can get this really nice coherent light source drawing the eye to where you want, and it's more interesting than just painting everything up to the same contrast. It's actually faster too, because on the darker areas you don't have to do as many stages. So there was way more tones on the pec on the left than there was on the pec on the right, so actually 2 fewer steps. So painting in this way has more impact, it's more logical, and it can be a bit quicker, which is awesome. Here I want to talk specifically about the shoulder pad, the left shoulder pad, and that's because I was never happy with the result. I'm okay with the end result, but I'll explain why it's not so great and you shouldn't copy it. This is not bad. I actually really like how I've got a huge area of light and then it drops into the shadow. I really like that. But the positioning is slightly wrong. It's slightly too low down. You compare it to where the light's hitting the shield in the brightest spot, and you can imagine it doesn't actually hit in the same place as I've put it on the shoulder pad. It should be higher up where the kind of hair meets the pad. So I wish I painted it in this way, but just a slightly different position. And I actually struggled to repaint it. I kept trying to move it, and I think it took me about 5 attempts to get to my final iteration. So yeah, it's annoying. And actually, because I had so much pale paint at this point, so it was almost pure ivory, I painted my other colours over it, like my English uniform and stuff. And because I was painting over very light paint, it was very bright and it just didn't match anything else. So I wish what I did at this point is realised it was wrong and just base coated it with really thin Rhinox hide and just started again. So that was my problem. If I could have taken the shoulder pad off, I would have stripped the paint and started again, because I was so happy with the pectoral, and of course I could have recreated that on the shoulder pad. I just messed up a little bit. But yeah, I'm just trying to say, don't copy my volumes here, try and think about how the light would hit that shoulder pad, because I just didn't get it quite right. This view is a really nice one of the torso at this stage, and I think it kind of solidifies the main lessons I wanted to get out of this. You can see the shape of the highlight on the upper right hand side of all the abs, and then you see the little area of shadow, and then we have that sort of bounce reflection in the slightly more orange tone. I think it looks really natural on the darker side, the pec that has not as bright highlights. I think that interaction between the mid-tone English uniform, the Rhinoxide shadow, and then the orange is really nice. And I think it fits the shape naturally. And to me, that's what painting miniatures is all about, is trying to get these highlights looking natural and the shapes right, because the shapes are obviously dictated for us. We're painting a physical model. So what I love about painting is how we can interpret those and just get the paint in the right place. And you can also see how effective it is to have this asymmetrical light, because that pec with loads of strong light looks really awesome. And it looks awesome because the areas around it are darker by comparison. If everything's super bright, then it takes away the shine, literally. So drawing attention to certain areas and having other areas darker by comparison makes it look better. This shot, you can see maybe my third attempt or something at the shoulder pad, and it's not bad. I think I tried to do a circular shape like the pec, and it just doesn't work because that's not the shape of the pad. It should be longer and more of a lozenge shape to kind of fit the pad. So you can see it's higher, which is the right place, but then the shape's not quite right. It should be more of an oval, following the shape of the pad. Always think of what's the shape of this armor plate and following that. Here I started painting some of the little gems, and this goes back to what we're talking about with the saturation. So I wanted them to be blue, which is obviously a nice contrast, but you don't want them to be too saturated or have too much light, because they just draw the eye too much. So you can see I kind of left black in the top corners and then glazed the base coat towards the bottom, and then just put quite a bright highlight, almost like an edge on the other side. And I think this was quite effective, but doesn't distract too much. And there you can see I've added highlights to all of them, and I think that looks right. But you definitely don't want the kind of main mid-tone to be a bright blue. I tried it out and it didn't work. So nice dark gems with just that hint of blue in the highlight, I think, is enough. And the chains I have on the side are silver, so maybe I should have done that with the silver tutorial, but it didn't make sense because I didn't do it in that order. I think this is the right time to paint them. So here I've painted Vallejo dark grey in a wide highlight on the top for the main light, left a little gap of black, and then done a smaller highlight, which is the reflection, also in dark grey, but we'll probably leave that almost that dark and just work on the upper highlight next. So in this shot you can see I've added some neutral grey, and the bottom highlight has a mix of neutral grey and dark grey, and that's the bottom reflection finished. You could actually have it with a hint of yellow in if you wanted to bounce off of the gold, but I kept it simple like this. And the final highlight is my favourite highlight skin, or you can use off-white and orange like we did in the silver before. So you can see very few steps for a small detail like this. And actually the smaller the detail, the easier it is to pull off the NMM effect, because we can get contrast in a very small space. We don't have to have as much transition or blending, and we can just make it look shiny quite easily. So little details like this can be quite fun in comparison to doing huge areas like the shield, which was far more difficult. Quite a nice shot here of the shield though. You can really see all my brush marks and where the colours are. So yeah, quite a nice one. So we're on to the final shots now with all the gold complete. And there's no more extra steps. I've kind of told you all the steps I've taken, I've just rolled it out across the entire model. You can see I ended up with these brighter highlights of ivory, and I ended up putting some slightly brighter highlights on the abs on both sides. Maybe it was better before, maybe it was more subtle. You can decide that for yourself. So I actually think before it was, a little more subtle, but this probably stands out a little more. And you can adjust that to your taste. Everyone's always going to have slightly different taste to how much they want it to pop out and how much contrast. If you look at the shoulder pad, this is where I ended up, and I was painting this shoulder pad right up until the deadline, and I'm talking, they asked for me to send photos, and I was looking at the clock and glazing Rhinox hide, I wasn't happy with it, and then I literally took a shot and emailed it off at the last point. So that was the best I could manage, and I quite like where it's ended up. The placement is good, the contrast is good. One of the things that isn't quite right is it drops to the Rhinox hide too suddenly. There should be more transition. You can see it just kind of stops, but it's not a sharp angle, it's rounded, so it should blend more gradually into the shadow. And that happened because what I was doing at this point was glazing Rhinox hide to get more contrast because I painted it too light, and I didn't have time to relayer or stipple in some English uniform mid-tone to kind of soften it. But still, I'm happy with how it looks, and it works well with the pec. So 5th time lucky on the shoulder pad, but still not perfect. So, but I think it's important for me to show you those critiques and point those things out, because I wouldn't want you to copy how I've done that, because I think it can be better. So I'd love for you guys to interpret that shoulder and do a better job than me. If I did it again, I think I could do it right first time. I mean, the pec just went so right. I'm really happy with that. I'd be happy for you to copy how I've done that. And for some reason, it just didn't go right. So don't get frustrated when that happens to you. Just come back to it and try it. If you have it in sort of separate pieces, maybe that'll help you in this way. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy me sort of talking about these major mistakes that I made. I've got a real close-up here of the torso section, and I've just added a few things here. So on that upper abdominal, you can see I actually did the kind of main light across the top, and then I did 2 little dots of ivory, and that's just a little trick to try and make it look more shiny, is just have a couple little dots of reflection. There's loads of little tricks that can help us to make this effect work. One thing I always say when we did physical classes, when we did non-metallic metal, and I was actually there, is don't worry about it looking actually gold in your hand, because it never will. All we're doing is an effect, and we're using little tricks to try and tell the person looking at it this is gold, but it's never going to look like gold paint. I think this comes from the internet actually, because when we see photos of miniatures, it can look gold. And the photos really help with that. And I don't mean that in a bad way, as in detrimental to the painter or anything like that, but it just helps. When we hold it in the hand, it's much easier to see that it's matte paint placed in a certain way, and it just looks matte. It looks shiny in the photo because we're not there, but our eyes can detect the texture when we're holding it in the hand. But don't let that discourage you. Just when you paint, you might be like, oh, mine doesn't look gold, but don't worry about it. It's like I said, it's just this effect we're trying to do. Whenever we're painting anything on a miniature, we're just trying to create information. So it's like hair doesn't look like hair. It's big chunky strands of plastic, but we will paint it in a way to tell the person what that material is. And the tricks to making us think something's metallic is this high contrast. And like I keep saying, the transition is quick and we don't have those even representations. And a big one is having the counter reflection, because if we have some colours bouncing on the shadow sides, that tells us, oh, that must be reflective because something's reflecting on it, especially if we use environmental colours. So if we're on green grass, if there's green on the underside, then again that helps with the trick because it says that's reflective. Therefore our mind fills in the blanks and we say that must be metal. Whereas if we have other areas like leather that aren't doing those things, then it makes us think, okay, that's something matte and stuff like that. It's the same reasons why we might use stippling or scratching for texture on leather and things like that. We're just trying to convey what that material is. So yeah, with non-metallic metal, try and think about these things we've talked about, but don't ever worry if you feel it doesn't look gold. Try and just make the most convincing effect you can. I think if you implement these rules, practice them and get the blending right, then you will be satisfied. The reason non-metallic metal is both hard and satisfying is it's difficult to trick people into thinking it's gold. But when you get it right and you look it in your hand and you go, yeah, that looks gold, it's great. It's a great feeling, and it took me a little while to get there. I'll see if I can dig out my first attempts at NMM gold for you to have a laugh at. But yeah, it's definitely one of the most satisfying techniques to do. Even if you don't do it all the time, I do encourage you to have a practice at this because it is fun eventually. And I hope with these tutorials it makes it more approachable and simpler to understand. That's all I ever want from these tutorials. So I think that's it from me and this video. I hope you've enjoyed that explanation. It's been fairly in-depth from my point of view, but I could talk about so many more things with non-metallic metal. But I think for a tutorial, that feels like enough information, and I'm happy with some of the cool things we talked about. And hopefully with the PDF that goes with this, that just has the steps in their basic forms, you can see clearly in the photos what I've done and try and follow it. This won't be the last non-metallic metal gold tutorial, and I do know that you guys probably prefer to see me actually paint the figure rather than talk over the photos. But I also hope that you enjoyed this, where I just really get the time to look at the close-ups and talk to you about why I did certain things. But I do have a project which is really awesome, and it's loads of non-metallic metal, so I'm saving myself for that. And this was just the practice, the warm-up for that, so I think you'll really enjoy that. But let me know what you think of this video, as always, and let me know if you're new to non-metallic metal, if this has made it seem more approachable. If you've tried it before, has this explained some things you weren't sure why it was like it? You know, it's been great getting your comments on the silver tutorial, so I'm looking forward to seeing what you think of this one. The final part, we're going to do the base and any final thoughts I have. But until then, enjoy your painting, and hopefully I get to see some of your Sigvalds. See you next time.